Hello, and welcome to a special edition of the U.S. Chamber Foundation's Path Forward series. Last week, news broke that scientists in South Africa discovered a new variant of COVID-19, known today as the Omicron variant. This variant has dozens of mutations, prompting doctors and scientists to begin searching for information about where it has spread, how transmissible it is, and how it reacts to existing vaccines. This variant has already been detected in over 20 countries around the world, and Dr. Fauci just announced today that a case was detected in California. As President Biden said in his address to the nation on Monday, this is cause for concern, but not panic. We are still in the very early stages, and we all want to do our part to protect ourselves and each other. The CDC has updated its guidance this week, recommending booster shots for all adults ages 18 and over. And our public health agencies are continuing to monitor the situation and provide updated guidance as it becomes available. This is yet another reminder, as we've talked about a lot on this series, that COVID-19 will not be defeated anywhere until it is defeated everywhere. This is certainly a global challenge that requires global solutions. Joining us today to discuss what we know and what we should expect over the coming weeks is Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy. Surgeon General Murthy joined this program in August. We're delighted to have him on again to provide the latest on these new developments. So let's get right to it. Let me ask you quickly about the breaking news and what we know about this variant showing up in California.
Well, it's so nice to be with you again, and I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, especially on a day like this, where we have new news to report. Here's what we know so far, and it's not a great deal, but the news is that there is the first variant, Omicron variant, has now been detected and confirmed here in the United States, in the state of California. This is in a traveler who came from South Africa who was vaccinated, because international travelers are now required to be vaccinated, and whose symptoms are mild. And my guess would be that those mild symptoms likely have to do with the fact that the individual was in fact vaccinated. We know that you do get a breakthrough infection that dramatically lowers your risk if you are vaccinated. So that is what we know so far. There's aggressive contact tracing that's underway at the moment to understand who else may have been in contact with this individual, to make sure that they also get tested and that they don't put others at risk. But we knew that this day would come when this new variant made its way to our shores. This is the nature of the world in 2021. In a world where people travel, the world is more connected than ever has been, and variants have always made their way, really across the world whenever they've shown up over the last 22 months. And this is no different. Finally, I'll just remind everyone of this. There are still three critical questions that we are trying to understand about Omicron. Number one, is it more transmissible than what we've been dealing with so far, Delta in particular? And number two, does it cause more severe disease than what we've seen? And number three, does it impact the protection that we get from vaccines and therapeutics like monoclonal antibodies? There still aren't clear answers to these questions yet, because it will take several weeks to gather the requisite data, clinical data, the laboratory data, to make that firm determination. You're going to hear a lot of claims over the next few days in the news from people who hear anecdotes or are looking at a small pocket of data and trying to draw conclusions from that. And I would just caution people against putting too much stock in those speculations, because we really want to get this right and want to make sure that people have answers to those three critical questions.
It's such an important point, and one of the many reasons we're glad you're with us today, to really make sure we're getting good information out there and abating confusion whenever we can. So let me start with at 30,000 feet, which is kind of what's a variant and what happened, if we're naming them after the Greek alphabet, what happened between D and O, right? So what happened to these other variants? How did this one become news like this?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And a variant is a version of COVID-19 that has a genetic mutation, so where the DNA profile is different. And I should tell you that variants are extraordinarily common, incredibly common, because every time a virus replicates, there's a chance that it could develop some mutations. And the virus, having infected millions of people, is replicating a lot, right? Now, the thing is, most variants are not consequential. They don't have really an impact on how easy it is for the virus to spread or how hardy it is. And so we never really have to worry about them. But every now and then, there'll be a variant that has changes that impact how it spreads or how severe the illness is that it causes or how responsive it is to some of our treatments. The reason this variant in particular drew attention from the scientific community was because of the sheer number of mutations it had, around 50 mutations, which is a large number, and the location of those mutations, which included the spike protein, which is sort of a key part of the virus that actually enables and allows its entry into your body's cells. And putting those things together, there was some concern that there's one other factor that mattered here that concerned scientists was seeing how quickly it was spreading in South Africa in the initial days. Now, with all of that said, looking at the mutations on a virus alone can't give you a clear understanding of whether it is, in fact, more transmissible or causes more severe disease. To understand the answers to those questions, you need a variety of types of data. We need laboratory data when we actually get an isolate of the virus or create something called a pseudovirus and actually test it against the serum of people who have been vaccinated to understand a little bit more about how the vaccinated state actually protects against the virus. We also need clinical data. We need to be able to look at what's actually happening in countries like South Africa, the patterns of hospitalization and who's being diagnosed, and understand among those people who's vaccinated and who's not. Does age seem to make a difference? Does prior infection status seem to make a difference? So that is why all of this, to get the answers and to delve into all that data does take several weeks, which is why we're urging people to be cautious. But that's why this variant in particular drew people's attention.
It was nice of you to not just teach me about the Greek alphabet and really understand what I was asking you. I think one of the things that really got people's attention was the WHO coming out and saying, this is the global risk related to this variant is very high. And I think the average citizen doesn't know what that means. And so can you help us understand what it means when the WHO says something that sounds alarming?
It's a really important question, and this is the challenging thing about moments like this is, you need to explain some of these things, because otherwise it can lead to a lot of alarm. So what they were concerned about is that the mutations were in a location and in a volume, if you will, a number that made them worry that there may in fact be greater transmissibility of the variant, and that it that our vaccines and our therapeutics may be less effective against the variant. So that's why they were particularly concerned and why they immediately moved to classify it as something called a variant of concern instead of a variant of interest, which is a less serious classification, if you will. But again, until we really know the data, we can't for sure say whether it is more transmissible and or causes more severe disease or is resistant to our vaccines. There's an important caveat that I want to put here, though, because some of this discussion about whether our vaccines will still work against this variant are being painted as a black and white question. Does it work or does it not? But that's actually not how the question will be answered. We know that there are degrees of protection that the vaccine can give us against different variants. And we've even seen that when we look at the Alpha variant versus the Delta variant versus the Gamma variant and the Beta variant. What we've seen actually is that there are varying levels of protection that we get. And we've still been able to maintain that protection in a high range, but there's some variation depending on which variant you are trying to protect against with your vaccine. So it is likely that our vaccines will still afford some protection against this new variant, especially if you not only got fully vaccinated, but you got boosted on top of that, because that really lifts your antibody levels and your other immune responses to an extraordinarily high level, where you can even overcome some of that variation that I was talking about earlier that we see in protection with some of the other variants. So the bottom line is, while we are waiting to get answers to these questions, we still believe that getting vaccinated and getting boosted is actually a strong and credible pathway to making sure that you're better off, if you do in fact come in contact with somebody who has the Omicron variant, because we've seen consistently throughout this whole pandemic, with all the variants that have come our way, that those who are vaccinated have consistently been better off than those who are unvaccinated in terms of their risk of infection, the risk of severe disease, and the risk of hospitalization and death.
So I want to come back to that in a minute, because I think there are a couple of good follow-up questions there. But let me start with, I think one of the other things that gives people comfort is the idea that there are professionals like you and with your expertise and others in the government that are preparing for a worst case scenario, right? So that not only do we have things that can fight this disease, but there are people in the federal government who are thinking about, you know, the worst case scenario here and what they would do. And so can you talk a little bit about that planning? Not because you think it's coming, but because I think it's comforting to people to know there is a plan.
Absolutely. And, you know, I always remember one of my teachers from grade school, you know, telling me, you hope for the best, you plan for the worst. And that is certainly true, you know, in terms of how we have been going about this, the planning in terms of our Omicron response, which, you know, one of the worst case scenario would be if there's a very low level of protection that you get from the vaccines, right? We don't, again, we're not saying that that's the case, but you know, thinking about what would the worst, you know, case outcomes be, that would be probably among one of them. Now, what do we need to do in that case? Well, we need to update our vaccines. Now, here's the good news. The good news is that the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines in particular were built on platforms, mRNA platforms, that are significantly easier and quicker to update than the traditional vaccine platforms like adenovirus platforms. And so you can actually move much faster. And you know, we've been talking, we actually moved very quickly to speak with the manufacturers immediately to build this contingency plan in and actually get it moving. So the companies could start, you know, on the production, you know, of a contingency vaccine, if you will. And it'll still take several months for them to produce a vaccine, to do the requisite tests, and then to the FDA and the CDC to review that data. But they're all working closely together now to make sure that process would be as short as possible, while without cutting any critical corners for safety and efficacy. But that is an important contingency. And here's the other thing that's going to be helpful to us is that we now have 11 months, nearly 12 months as a country, of solid experience rolling out this vaccine, including to communities that are not always easy to reach. And you know, we have, for example, right now, you know, more than 80% of adults in this country, more than 80% of people 12 years old and above have had at least one shot of the vaccine. That's pretty extraordinary. When you look at the numbers among Black, Hispanic, and white adults, we have actually roughly similar proportions of individuals who have been vaccinated, which is a testament to how hard community members and us and everyone has worked to close the equity gap. So the bottom line is we have a playbook for how to not only manufacture and update the vaccine, but also for how to deliver it to people effectively. And we will certainly call on that playbook if we need to. But for right now, the most important thing people can do is to go out there and get boosted if you are already vaccinated. And certainly if you're not vaccinated, getting vaccinated as quickly as possible is the best thing you can do.
You know, I will tell you, I got boosted this week and I was really surprised and proud to live in a country where it was so easy, you know, and it's really a gift that it was easy to do and no lines and I think the more people that we can get out there and get protected, the better. So we're seeing some positive signals potentially out of South Africa. We've had a doctor say she really feels that the symptoms are more mild of this variant. And so it leads to the question of, is one of the possibilities here that this variant could crowd out Delta because it is more transmissible and make the situation actually a little better?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. And if it does turn out, in fact, that it is milder in severity, but spreads more easily, then that certainly could be a possibility. The one thing, though, to be cautious about with those anecdotes that you're hearing from South Africa is that you know, a number of the people who have been impacted initially by the virus are young people. You know, this started actually in the early days on university campuses, et cetera, in terms of where it was detected or among university student populations. And so when we hear that the cases are mild, we have to just keep in mind that younger people tend to have milder cases. And so it doesn't necessarily tell us that overall how this variant affects the population is milder necessarily than the Delta variant. So we've got to wait and see. But if there is a scenario where it's milder, but in fact spreads more easily, then sure, that could be an interesting way through which it could crowd out more dangerous variants. And there's some people who certainly hope that's the case. I mean, that would be one potentially favorable scenario. But one last thing just to keep in mind about the transmissibility. While it has moved very quickly in South Africa after the numbers going up, we should also remember that it didn't definitively outcompete Delta in South Africa because South Africa went through a Delta wave over the summer. But cases had dramatically come down, and we're in fact at some of their lowest numbers, during the entire pandemic when this new variant arose. So that is very different, for example, than what happened with Delta and Alpha. Like Delta outcompeted the Alpha variant. There's a lot of Alpha around, and all of a sudden Delta started rising, and Alpha fell because it was outcompeted by Delta. But that's not exactly what happened here. It was more that there was an open field, if you will, that this new variant started to run in. So again, all that points to the fact that we've got to do the work now to make sure that we fully understand the transmissibility and severity and vaccine efficacy. It'll take a few weeks, but in addition to the vaccine and boosters being important, the same measures that we've been using to protect ourselves from spread, including wearing masks, including hand hygiene, distancing, precautionary testing for gatherings when needed. Like these are all measures which still help to reduce risk.
So, okay, that gives me a couple threads I want to pick up on. Let me see if I can organize them. So one is, you and I have talked before about the fact that the ways these variants emerge is that that COVID-19 can exist in a host, maybe without symptoms, and kind of learn to mutate. This is my non-medical background way of describing it, right? But and it gets to the importance of people getting vaccinated. And it's not just that they're not afraid of getting ill, but that they could help these variants emerge kind of unknowingly. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, no, you were saying exactly right. The more people who are vaccinated, the fewer places the virus has to hide. And when the virus hides inside people, that's when it replicates. When it replicates is when it mutates and when new variants develop. So every time a person gets vaccinated, not only are they protecting themselves and the people around them, but they're reducing the chances that a new variant would develop. And so in your own way, you're not just helping yourself, but you're helping the community. So the way you said it, is spot on.
So we need to keep encouraging people to get vaccinated, even if they're not afraid of their own health or the risk to their own health. Let me ask you.
And actually, on that point, because what you said is exactly right. I just want to underscore that. The reason to get vaccinated is for you, but for the people also around you, not even just for the broader community to prevent variants. But think about the people you know in your life, right, who might be more vulnerable than you may be. Maybe they're older, maybe they're younger, but have other medical illnesses. We've seen so many cases where somebody has been a mild or asymptomatic, carrier of the virus and has passed it on to somebody who's had a really severe case, and in some cases has passed away. That has been an all too common story. So just think about your loved ones and think about this as a way to protect them. And if you're a parent like me and you've got young kids at home, if your kids are not vaccinated or maybe not old enough to be vaccinated yet, this is also getting vaccinated as a way to protect your children, to shield them in a sense from the virus, since they don't have the ability yet to get vaccinated themselves.
And so, while you have this platform, let me go off topic for just a minute and let you myth bust for a minute. There are a lot of myths out there about the vaccine and potential health impacts or impacts on fertility or, magnetic chips being put in people's arms. Or is there any truth to any of these myths that are out there about health reasons not to get the vaccine that hasn't been tested enough, that we don't understand the long-term implications?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because one of the most disturbing polls that I've seen has showed that 78% of adults right now in America either believe a common myth about the COVID-19 vaccine or COVID, or think that one of those myths might be true. That's an extraordinary testament to the power and speed and spread of misinformation. There's been a lot of it during this pandemic, but let's just run through and dispel a few of them. A very common myth, one of the most common, is that COVID causes infertility. Absolutely no evidence to suggest that it does. There are many people who have gotten the vaccine, who have gotten pregnant, who have been pregnant when they got the vaccine and done really well. The CDC has now done extensive data reviews on COVID during pregnancy, and has found that the vaccine is safe, which is why the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists strongly recommends it. The flip, by the way, is that we know that when you're in pregnancy, you're at higher risk for bad outcomes if you get COVID. So higher risk of hospitalization, of intensive care unit stay, higher risk of having preterm labor and preterm birth. Like COVID is bad in pregnancy, and so it's even more important that you get vaccinated during pregnancy. But a few other myths just to dispel. There's a myth circulating that the COVID-19 vaccine causes COVID itself. It absolutely does not. It does not have the entire virus in it, so there's no way it can cause COVID. There's a myth out there that it causes mutations in your DNA, which is absolutely not true. There's no DNA that's actually being inserted like into your system. RNA and DNA are actually very different. And RNA is basically like an instruction book that's telling your cells to make this spike protein so that you can raise an army of antibodies against that protein. So when you encounter the real virus, that army will be there and you won't have to spend weeks and weeks building it and sustain severe illness. And finally, there are some myths out there that the vaccine has a microchip in it, so you can be tracked. That's absolutely not true. I don't even know how that would happen, that you would create something like that. I've actually spoken with the people who have been involved in manufacturing and creating the vaccine in the first place, and they have affirmed that there's absolutely no truth to any of this. And finally, just look at the process of how the vaccine was developed. There's a myth out there that this was rushed and somehow corners were cut. Absolutely not true. What happened and what was really cut were inefficiencies in red tape. What was enabled during this process was an extraordinary, unprecedented level of scientific collaboration across the world. This is an example of the world stepping up in the face of a crisis to say, how can we work together, scientists of all nationalities, and figure this out? And they helped develop a vaccine with remarkable thoroughness and efficiency and quality, but in a remarkably short period of time. But here's what was not cut short at all: the process of testing that vaccine. The clinical trials that were run to look at the vaccines were robust. They were large clinical trials. They were thoroughly vetted. The data that came from those trials by independent scientists, by government scientists, the data was made available for the public to see. And it was only after doing the same thorough review that the FDA does for all other vaccines that it finally issued a decision to authorize a vaccine. And if you have any doubts about this, keep in mind, we now have administered more than 450 million doses of the vaccine in the United States and billions of doses around the world. And we've been tracking the data, the safety data, on a continuous basis. And what we've learned is really two things from all of that real world experience. Number one, the vaccines remain highly effective, particularly preventing hospitalization and death. And number two, we've learned that the safety profile of the vaccine remains remarkably strong. So when you think about the vaccine, just remember, risks very, very low, benefits very, very high. That's why so many doctors and nurses are out there recommending and urging, and in some cases pleading with their patients to get vaccinated. It's the safest way to protect your health, the health of the people around you.
That was terrific, and I'm sure we'll be cutting that and sending that out as far and wide as we can. So let me go back to, I heard you say that there's a lot we can't know yet, that it's really early, but we have no reason to think that the vaccines aren't helpful, right? That the vaccines that we have would at least temper this illness. And so I heard you say that, and I heard you say there's a lot we don't know, but I'm still going to ask you, do the COVID-19 tests that we have still work to pick up this variant?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's certainly something that we've been in touch with the testing manufacturers as well, because we want them to double check and triple check and make sure that this works. But I'll just give you a simple example. The case that was just detected today in California was detected using the tests that we've been using, like in this country, right? It tells us that that detection system worked. You think about the cases that have been detected around the world, they're not using new tests that they just developed for Omicron. They're using tests that we've been using throughout this pandemic for COVID-19. So we do have reason to believe that the tests will continue to work. We want to verify that though, obviously. And we're doing the requisite studies because again, we're certainly optimistic that we can handle this, but we want to also make sure that every contingency is in place, whether it's around testing, vaccines, or therapeutics. So more to come there. But lastly, you didn't ask about this, but I just want to mention it. It's a common question. People often ask, what about the therapies, the treatments for COVID-19? Are those going to be affected as well? There's certainly a chance that the monoclonal antibodies, which are the antibodies, which are sort of, these are synthetic soldiers, if you will, that you get that mimic the antibodies your body develops, and they help prevent bad cases of the infection. There's certainly a possibility that those antibodies may not work as well, but there are also two oral medicines that you take by mouth that the FDA is actively considering. One made by Merck, one made by Pfizer, and there's still good reason to believe that the efficacy, the effectiveness of those oral medications may not be as significantly affected with this new variant. Again, everything, and that's sort of based on the biology of how they actually act against the virus. So all this is to say that there are reasons to be optimistic. There's still ways we can protect ourselves. There's still a lot more questions we have to answer. We're doing that diligence to make sure we get firm answers to these questions about our vaccines, our therapeutics, and certainly about the transmissibility and severity of the virus.
I think I heard you say that you might expect some of the effectiveness of the therapeutics to be diminished. Is that right?
Well, it's possible with the monoclonal antibodies that they may be effective. It's certainly possible because we know that they target specific parts of the virus. And if there are mutations in those parts of the virus in this new variant, then these monoclonal antibodies may not be able to attach as easily to the virus and may not be able to then activate and recruit the immune system to clear the virus from your system. So that's why there's a theoretical risk there. But again, the only way we'll know for sure is actually to test the monoclonal antibodies against the virus or a pseudovirus in the laboratory. That's the work that's underway.
So, Doctor, let me ask you a question. Well, we're getting a lot of audience questions and they really come across, they're in groups, right? And one is going back to testing, which is, should we be doing more testing right now? Is this a moment to ramp up the rapid testing?
It's a good question. I do think that, it's worth being more cautious in moments like this, not just because of Omicron, but because there's still a lot of Delta variant that's circulating in the community. We're registering more than 80,000 cases a day, of virus and, viral cases in this community. That's all Delta right now, 99.9%. And so I do think, and especially with the winter coming, people going indoors, we know the virus also spreads more easily in cold, dry air. This is a time where utilizing the tools that we have in our toolbox now to keep ourselves safe makes sense. And testing is one of those tools. So if you're, for example, thinking about going to a holiday gathering, all right, for later in December, or just getting together, with friends before the holidays, we know that testing, once you gather, before you all take masks off and interact, that can be one strategy to further reduce risk in addition to getting vaccinated and getting boosted. So yes, testing is certainly something that I would strongly encourage people to take advantage of, if they can before gatherings. I'll just give you an example of something we did in my family with the Thanksgiving holidays. My wife went actually to see her parents in California, so I was home in Washington D.C. with our two small children, one of whom just got his first shot. He's 5 years old, and we're very excited, but that means he's not fully vaccinated yet. And I have a daughter who's almost 4, so she's too young to get vaccinated. So she's not protected. But my parents were coming to visit, and they were coming from Florida. And so they're vaccinated, they're boosted. But when they came, we also tested them with a rapid test to make sure they were negative, and gave us an additional layer of precaution. Finally, I'll just tell you this, what we did for my parents also is they reduced their risk for about 10 days before they came to visit us. Now, how do you reduce your risk? Well, if you go out to restaurants and you eat without a mask and you're not sure people are vaccinated in the restaurant, that's it's probably a slightly riskier activity than if you were to eat outdoors, right, where we know the risk is less. If you get together indoors, with folks in their homes and they're not vaccinated and you're not sure what their COVID status is, that's a higher risk activity than again gathering outdoors or gathering with fully vaccinated people. And those are all the things that you can modify in your life if you want to reduce your risk before you gather. So the bottom line is this: we are not back in March 2020 when this first really revved up in the United States. We have more tools, more knowledge about how to protect ourselves and our families. And this is really the time for us to double down on those learnings, utilize those tools so that we can actually go about much of our life at work and at home the way that we all want to.
So that goes right into another audience question we have, which is, people are saying, oh my gosh, I was going to England for the first time to see my family over the holidays or even domestic travel. And so we're getting a lot of audience questions about, how should they be thinking about disruptions in travel?
Yeah, it's important. I think some of this depends in part on people's individual risk tolerance. I think when it comes to domestic travel, for example, we certainly know that wearing masks can be a very effective way, especially high quality masks. And N95 masks are great in particular. But these are ways that you can help to reduce, your risk of getting, sick when you fly. Hand hygiene continues to be important. As simple as that seems, it's an important method of preventing spread. And then making sure that, when you transit also through an airport, making sure that you're not taking off your mask and eating in the airport for a prolonged period of time. That's another way, again, that you increase risk. We won't be able to eat if you want to eat, but keeping that time short, making sure as much as possible you're in well-ventilated spaces. Those are all things that can help. When it comes to international travel, recently the administration instituted global travel rules to help reduce risk, and that meant they required vaccination for travelers, non-American travelers, and they required everybody, whether you're a U.S. citizen, a long-term resident, or a foreign national, everybody to test before they got on the flight and to provide evidence of a negative test. Those are actually two very strong and important measures to help reduce the risk of people traveling, in addition, of course, to wearing a mask when you fly. The CDC now is looking at taking additional measures to strengthen even further the safety for international travelers, including shortening actually the window during which you have to provide a negative test before international travel from 72 hours to 24 hours. That helps make sure there's a smaller window through which to make sure you catch virus if it's actually there. And they're certainly looking at other measures for after passengers land to help do things like contact tracing, to help enhance testing, and to even more strongly recommend that people quarantine after they arrive from international flights here for at least 7 days if they test, and for 10 days if they're not able to test. So all of this just to say that there are measures in place that we've already put in to make international travel safer. But look, if you're somebody who's got young kids at home or vulnerable people at home who are immunocompromised, or if you yourself are immunocompromised, it's very understandable, that people may calibrate their risks differently, in a time like this. But the bottom line is the measures that are in place will help reduce risk. And there are additional measures that we can take, certainly to help reduce our risk even further before we gather with family and friends.
So a couple of, going back to vaccinations, a couple of audience questions. I'll give you two at one time. One is, if I've already had COVID, I don't really have to be vaccinated, right? And the other is, would getting a booster sooner than 6 months help?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And look, the question about prior infection is an important one and a very reasonable one to ask, because we know that when you get other viruses or bacterial infections, that your body builds up antibodies, right? It builds up some natural defense so that you're less likely to get sick again in the future. And our body likely does that with COVID-19 as well. But here's the challenge, and here's why I would say that prior infection is not a substitute for getting vaccination at this point, given what we understand. Because when you look at the studies that have been done on infection-related immunity, what you find is that there seems to be significant variation in the population in terms of the quality of protection that you get. There are some studies, for example, a study from Israel, which show that people actually had very strong protection after getting COVID-19. But there are all these other studies that have shown that it really actually depends on how serious or severe your infection was. If, for example, if you had a severe infection, the studies showed that people had very high antibody levels, but if they had a mild infection, there's a much greater sort of range, if you will, of an antibody response that they generated. There was a study out of Denmark, additionally, which showed that the protection varied based on your age as well, and that people who were 65 and over had a much, much lower level of protection from prior infection compared to those who were younger. And the other thing we don't understand fully also is how people respond over time, how long their protection lasts. And so this is the bottom line is that we have studied vaccine-related immunity much, much greater degree with much greater precision. And so we understand the kind of protection that it affords in people of different ages and different backgrounds, different comorbidities, meaning other illnesses. We have less clarity around that with when it comes to infection-related immunity. And we have a number of studies, some of which are showing that protection may be variable depending on a patient's characteristics. That is why we're continuing to recommend, even if you got infected before, that you get vaccinated. And finally, keep this in mind. The studies have shown that if you got infected and you get vaccinated on top of that, you really boost your protection to incredibly high levels. So much so that studies from Kentucky and New York City have now shown that when you look at people who had prior infection and those who got vaccinated and those who didn't get vaccinated, the people who were not vaccinated after their infection were more than twice as likely to develop a subsequent infection, in other words, to get reinfected, compared to people who got vaccinated after their infection. So bottom line is, infection is not a substitute for vaccination. And so we want people to get vaccinated regardless of your prior infection status.
I think that's very clear medical advice. Thank you for that. And what about the second part? Should I get my booster sooner than 6 months?
Yeah, it's a good question. And some people may all be wondering this because there was some news recently that in the UK that they were actually urging people to get boosted at an earlier time frame. But here's what I would say. When we look at the data and based on our vaccination, our vaccines available and our vaccination timetable, which is different from what they had in the UK, we are still recommending that 6 months is around the mark that you should likely get vaccinated or rather get boosted after your Pfizer or Moderna shot. If you got J&J though, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, you should get boosted 2 months after that shot. And many people are likely already at that mark. So again, I think that's the time frame where we see the protection against infection really start to drop. So that's still the time frame that I'd recommend. Is it harmful to you if you get vaccinated a week earlier, a week later, or plus or minus a few weeks here and there? No, it's likely not that big of a deal. But 6 months is still the general recommendation.
We've talked a lot about what we don't know and how hard it is to say we don't know, right? When there are people who want advice and they're scared. And I think one of the problems with not knowing is also that it produces this ambiguity that can make people just throw their hands up, right? And say, I can't follow this. It's been too long. I'm kind of done. And so my question for you, you're talking to an audience of employers and community leaders, right? And as they're talking as thought leaders in their communities or to their own employees about this new variant, what's the best information that they can give people who trust them and are looking to them for advice?
Actually, it's so important because our mental state of mind, right? Like where our emotions are, make a huge difference in how we receive information. And the truth is that a lot of us are tired, right, at this point. We've been at this pandemic for 22 months. And then we hear this news about a new variant with unknowns. And understandably, many people may feel exhausted or fatigued or frustrated and feel like, oh my gosh, this is never going to end. But there are a few things I think that are important to convey to people. Number one, we are in fact in a very different place now than we were a year ago, and certainly a very different place than we were in March 2020. We've not regressed in any way to square one. And why is that? It's because we have a much better understanding of how to protect ourselves from this virus. So that's the first thing to remember. And the second thing to remember is that there are, even if this variant has different characteristics, there are still measures that will help us. And we know that they will help. We know that masking helps. We know that testing before gatherings can help reduce risk. We know that vaccination has been a proven way with every variant we've seen to date to reduce your risk of infection, hospitalization, and death. And that will likely continue to be the case to some degree. We're waiting to find out the exact degree. But the bottom line is vaccinated people will be much likely to be better off than those who are unvaccinated. Those all remain true. And finally, just to think about what this means for the activities that we can do. I think for many people, when they think about COVID-19, what is most painful about it is having to give up the things that we love, being able to see our family and friends, being able to take our children to play dates, being able to see our kids compete in youth sports, being able to go to our church or synagogue or our mosque, for services and celebrate, and reflect with others. These are the things that so many people miss that are part of their lives. And the bottom line is we actually have the ability to do a lot of these activities with much, much lower risk, even in the face, of these new variants. And so I would just remind people that the progress that we have made has not been lost, that the protection that we have gained through vaccination will still help us, but that there are steps that we can take now, including getting boosted if we haven't been, that can boost and increase that protection to even higher levels. So this is not, not easy, but I'll finally just say this. I think one of the most important things to do when communicating to people about these things is to just start by listening, understanding like what are their concerns, what's worrying them about this, because there may be different things that worry different people. Some people might be tired of working from home all the time, and they might think, oh my gosh, this is going to mean that I'm never going to be able to come back to work again. Other people might think, oh my gosh, this is going to mean that I'm not going to be able to see my family again. I had a relative, who, sorry, not a relative, I have a friend whose mother is in a nursing home and was worried that this would mean that the nursing homes would close their doors to visitors again, and that he wouldn't be able to come, see his mother. So everyone has different concerns, and being able to listen to those concerns, give people an opportunity to voice them, is also very, very important, because all of us are holding just a lot of suffering and pain and struggle over these last 22 months. And again, it goes a long way to allowing people to listen to what you have to say by giving them a chance to speak to you first and tell you where they are.
Such good advice. It's so important. When do you think we will know more? You've made the good point about the stuff we need to find out to really be able to say what this new variant means. What's the time frame for analyzing that data?
So I think we will know more somewhere in the neighborhood of within 2 weeks, and we'll be able to get a much better sense in that time frame of how transmissible the virus is and how it responds to the protection that we're getting from vaccines and how it responds to our therapeutics. So, we'll continue to certainly build our data and our understanding even well past that. But I think that's the time frame we'll get some initial answers to these important questions.
If you can believe it, I didn't hear what you said. I heard you say the rest of it, but then the word right before weeks was a little mumbled, maybe on purpose, so you didn't have to give a number. But
no. I said it's likely in the order of 2 to 3 weeks that we will have some answers, some initial answers to these questions, and we'll continue to get more data and strengthen our understanding about the answers to these questions in the weeks that follow that. But the reason that we're talking about that kind of time frame is that's the amount of time that it generally takes in order to isolate these viruses, to make sure they can grow in the lab, to test them against the serum, of people who have been vaccinated, to create the pseudoviruses and test them as well, to gather enough data about the clinical course that people go through who get this infection to understand if it has more severity and who's infected. Because keep in mind, once somebody gets sick, there's a certain time period that virus sort of evolves in their body, and then if they're going to end up in the hospital, that may take like a week, or maybe 7, 8 more days for that sort of severity of infection to develop. They may be in the hospital for a while, and God forbid if they pass away, that may happen a week or so after they end up in the hospital. So, if you really want to understand the answer to the question, are people more likely to die if they have this variant compared to other variants? You have to wait for that entire process to play out in a number of people over time. So that's why this isn't a question of just getting more people to work on the problem. Like there's literally time has to pass for certain key events to happen. And then we have to look at all those events in aggregate and then understand what that means for these questions.
I think you said something, so we've said a lot of important things, but one of the important things I think you said was that we're learning to calibrate risk, right? That when this first came out, we had blunt tools and blunt instruments. We also had no therapeutics and no vaccines, and we're really living in a different place now. If I can give a plug to the private sector, I'm so proud to work for. They've done a great job in getting us to this place, I think. And the question, as we learn to live with this, is kind of, when do we get to a place where this is endemic, where it doesn't go away? It's like the flu. We learn to live with it and really segment our population to protect the most vulnerable, but not need big blunt tools. Do you imagine there's a time when that comes?
I do. And in fact, I think we're getting closer and closer to that time. What we need is, in an ideal world, what we want to do is we want to reduce the severity of the infections that people get, right? Like if we could snap our fingers and make COVID like a common cold, that would be great, because we don't have too many people who die from the common cold, but unfortunately that's not the case with COVID. The second thing that we want to do is we want to reduce the overall number of infections if possible, because we also know that there's some risk of long COVID that people experience, and that the more virus is circulating, the more people who are vulnerable, like those who are immunocompromised, might be at risk. right? So in order to achieve those two goals, there are a few things that will help. We know that certainly vaccines help in both categories to reduce the number of infections. And if you do have a breakthrough infection, it'll reduce the severity of that infection. But we also know that the therapeutics like monoclonal antibodies and oral medicines, that those can actually help reduce the severity of infection for those who do in fact end up getting COVID. And that's why it's so important that we have a couple of oral medications that are on the horizon that are being analyzed by the FDA right now, because that will put more tools in our toolbox that can again knock down the power and severity of COVID-19. And I think there are some of these mitigation measures that we've been using, like masks. I think it will be very interesting is for us over the coming months is to become better at using them situationally, right? So if I'm, for example, a parent who's got young kids at home and they're not yet vaccinated, and I'm going to be going to, let's say, going on a long international flight, right? Wearing a mask is a way that I can help to reduce my risk, even further when I'm in a cabin with a whole bunch of other people for a long period of time. And so we will get better, I think, situationally at using masks. And I also think there's something, look, we often, like many people talk about benchmarking to flu, right? I actually think, in terms of how many deaths we can accept, how many cases we can accept, I actually don't think we've done a great job with flu, right? I think a lot of people still don't get vaccinated for flu. And we also, I think, accept a very high level or number of deaths, every year from the flu, anywhere from 30,000 to 60,000 deaths a year, depending on how bad a flu season we're having. But a lot of the measures that we're using for COVID-19 will actually help with reducing the likelihood of people getting the flu as well. We had so few cases of the flu in the 2020-21 flu season because people were actually using a lot of the COVID precautions. So the bottom line is we're already well on our way. We're getting to a place where we can learn to live with COVID and where we can suffer less in terms of lives lost and hospitalizations from COVID. But we have more work to do, because keep in mind, we've got 45 million people who are eligible to get vaccinated, above the age of 12 who are not yet vaccinated. We just started our kids campaign for kids 5 through 11. We've had 4 million children already vaccinated in the last couple of weeks, but we've got many more children, and there are 24 million children in that age group who we need to vaccinate. So we've got more work to do, no doubt. But again, if you look at last year compared to this year, even if you look at 6-9 months ago compared to now, we have learned to do a lot of the activities that we want to do more safely. My kids did not trick or treat last year. My kids trick or treated this year, like many, many other children around the country. A lot of people didn't get together for Thanksgiving last year. This year, with a combination of vaccines and testing and judicious use of masks and paying attention to ventilation, and trying to eat when you're unmasked in better ventilated settings, people were able to enjoy Thanksgiving with families all across America in a way that wasn't feasible for them 12 months ago. So we're absolutely making progress, and I want to give it just kudos to the private sector as well, the businesses out there that have done 2 incredibly important things, I think, during this pandemic. Number one, they prioritized the safety of their workers and worked incredibly hard to make it possible to telework when that was important, to figure out how to safely bring their workers back, to encourage them to get vaccinated in order to create safer workplaces for everyone. But the other thing that I've seen a growing number of businesses do, which I would certainly encourage all businesses to do, is that more companies are paying more attention to the mental health and well-being of their employees, which is so extraordinarily important. I mean, if COVID has told us anything, it's that our mental health affects our overall health and how we show up at work, in school, and in our communities. And workplaces that are able to consider and think about and invest in the mental health and well-being of their employees are ones that can not only ultimately create employees who can give more to the organization itself, but they're contributing to society. Because we know that when people are happier and do better at work, they are happier moms and dads. They are people who can contribute more to their community outside of work as well. So I just want to applaud the community and the business community for the incredible work that's done during an incredibly difficult year and a half, where there's been so much uncertainty. But my hope is that coming out of this, that we might even be able to come out of this with a renewed and invigorated sense of what the workplace could be, not just a place where work can get done, but an environment that contributes to well-being, that supports mental health, that builds a sense of community and connection and purpose for people at work, which we know will impact positively the rest of them.
I appreciate those comments, and I think it's been a remarkable time to be the Surgeon General as well. I'm sure. I'm looking forward to getting to the other side of this and having you back for conversations really about. Like you made some good points about red tape and cutting red tape. And so what did we learn when we had to that should be applied to more government processes, right? What did we learn about the private sector and government working together that should be applied to more going forward? And so getting to the other side and learning to live with COVID and protect the most vulnerable and getting to a point where we can apply these learnings across the board, I think will leapfrog the whole country forward.
Absolutely. And that phrase that you just used, I think is an important one, learning to live with COVID. And just to expand on that, some people, when they hear that, they think, oh my God, that means we're going to have to tolerate hundreds of thousands of deaths every year. That means that we're not going to be able to do things we want. That's not what learning to live with COVID means. What learning to live with COVID means is figuring out how to use the growing number of tools we have in our toolbox to live our lives in ways that allow us to do the things that we need to do for our children, for our colleagues at work, for our communities. That's what learning to live with COVID means, and doing so in a way that's a lot safer so that we don't lose as many people, so that people don't end up in the hospital the way they did during this pandemic. And I feel more confident today than I have felt at any point in this pandemic that goal is actually achievable and that we are on our way.
Well, listen, we can't thank you enough for your service. We can't thank you enough for joining us today, and particularly for ending on that optimistic note. So Surgeon General Murthy, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And thanks again to everyone who's joining today and all the organizations who are part of the Chamber of Commerce for everything you're doing to serve our communities and serve workers each and every day. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And to all of you for tuning in, thank you for reducing confusion and getting facts out there and being the community leaders that we know you are. It's interesting, the Surgeon General just said it'll be 2 to 3 weeks when we get more information, and we happen to have Dr. Fauci on December 16th at 1 o'clock on this exact show. So we'll look forward to having you with us. You'll get an invitation soon. Be sure to submit your questions, because we are going to feature some audience questions via video during that program. So in the meantime, get vaccinated, get your booster shot, and stay safe and optimistic. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
I'll look forward to that as well. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.